Welcome to the deep dive. Looks like we've got a quite a pile of research here on geoengineering and international law, and yeah, it seems like you're really interested in the potential risks of solar geoengineering and the need for some kind of global control over it. So let's try to untangle this web, and I think Expert Seeker is just the person to help us with that.
The research you've provided paints a pretty complex picture. And concerning, too. We're looking at global temperatures that could rise more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. Some studies even project a 5.7 degrees Celsius increase under, the worst-case scenarios.
Yeah, those are some pretty big numbers. But why is everyone talking about geoengineering, specifically SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, as a solution? I mean, isn't that a bit like playing with fire?
Well, the appeal of SAI is that it could reduce temperatures pretty quickly. It's actually inspired by things like the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, where huge amounts of sulfates were injected into the stratosphere, and that caused a temporary global cooling of about 0.5 degrees Celsius.
So we're talking about mimicking a natural phenomenon, but on a global scale. But wouldn't artificially injecting sulfates into the stratosphere have its own risks? I mean, volcanoes are pretty unpredictable, and we don't exactly have an off switch for them.
You're right. Volcanic eruptions are chaotic, and if we try to replicate those effects through SAI, it would require a level of precision and control we've never even attempted before. And yeah, there are significant risks. One major concern is the potential damage to the ozone layer, which, as you know, shields us from harmful UV radiation.
Right, we've worked so hard to repair the damage from CFCs. SAI could just undo all of that.
It could, yeah. And the research also mentions ocean acidification. That's another serious risk.
Yeah, what's the connection there?
Unfortunately, sulfate aerosols, once they start settling back down from the stratosphere, they could make ocean acidification worse, which is already a major threat to marine ecosystems. You know, coral reefs dying off, shellfish struggling to form shells, and a ripple effect throughout the food chain.
And here's what really worries me. The idea of a moral hazard. You know, like a quick fix that might distract us from actually reducing emissions.
That's a crucial point. SAI is pretty inexpensive compared to the huge effort needed to decarbonize our economies, and it could tempt governments and industries to see it as an easy way out and just delay the essential shift to renewable energy.
Right, and it seems like SAI could also create or worsen global inequalities.
You're thinking along the right lines. The research you provided highlights how SAI could make things worse. Climate change already has a disproportionate impact on those who contributed least to it. And SAI, by altering weather patterns unevenly, could benefit some regions while harming others. It's like giving a few countries control of the global thermostat, while others are left to deal with the consequences.
So potentially we're creating a recipe for conflict, countries battling over who controls this global thermostat. That sounds pretty intense.
You've hit on a very real risk that the research refers to as geoengineering wars. Imagine one country deciding to deploy SAI on its own, disrupting vital weather patterns like monsoons that other countries depend on for food security. That could easily be seen as an act of aggression, which could potentially escalate into conflict.
This is starting to sound a bit like a sci-fi thriller, but I guess in the age of climate change, the line between fiction and reality is getting pretty blurry. But what about existing international legal frameworks? Do they offer any safeguards against this kind of scenario?
That's the million-dollar question. The research points to several treaties and principles of international law that might be relevant. For instance, there's the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and customary international law principles like the no-harm principle and the precautionary principle. However, these are either too broad in scope or lack strong enforcement mechanisms when it comes to something as specific and potentially disruptive as SAI.
So we have these well-intentioned agreements, but they might not be equipped to handle this new challenge. What about something like the UNMOD treaty? Didn't that deal with environmental modification techniques for hostile purposes? Could that be relevant?
The UNMOD treaty is an interesting case. It was designed primarily to prevent weaponizing weather modification, like what happened during the Vietnam War. SAI, while it could have widespread and severe effects, isn't typically intended as a weapon. It's mostly aimed at lowering temperatures, not causing direct harm, so whether EMO would apply is debatable. It's not a perfect fit.
So it seems we're in a bit of a legal gray area here, and that's never a comfortable place to be, especially when dealing with something as potentially impactful as geoengineering. But weren't there some other treaties mentioned in the research?
Yeah, the research also discusses the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, which, interestingly enough, directly addresses geoengineering risks. It acknowledges the potential impact of SAI on biodiversity and calls for a precautionary approach. However, the CBD also recognizes the need for a more robust and comprehensive governance structure specifically designed to regulate geoengineering activities that might affect biodiversity.
But isn't there a catch with the CBD?
You're right. The U.S., one of the major players in this field, isn't a party to the CBD.
So we've got this tangled web of well-meaning agreements, but they might ultimately be insufficient to address the unique challenges of SAI. It sounds like a real governance gap.
Exactly. The research highlights this critical gap in global governance. We have these pieces of the puzzle treaties addressing related issues, principles like the no-harm principle, and calls for precaution. But they don't form a complete picture, a comprehensive framework capable of effectively regulating SAI research, development, and potential deployment.
And to add another layer of complexity, private companies are now entering the picture.
That's right. Several private companies are investing in SAI technology, which is raising concerns about control and the potential for profit-driven deployment. This just adds another layer to an already complex governance challenge.
Wow, so we have a perfect storm brewing a potentially dangerous technology, a lack of clear international regulations, and private interests entering the fray. What does this all mean? Where do we go from here?
Well, the research seems to converge on one key point: the urgent need for a robust and legitimate global governance framework that's specifically designed to regulate SAI. We need something that can prevent unilateral action, establish clear rules, and ensure that any decisions about SAI are made responsibly and with input from all stakeholders.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, the risks, and the limitations of existing legal frameworks. But what could this new governance framework actually look like? What are some concrete solutions?
The research suggests a few possibilities. One idea is a new multilateral treaty focused specifically on SAI, similar in structure and scope to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Such a treaty could establish clear rules for research, development, and deployment, along with robust monitoring and enforcement mechanisms.
That sounds promising, but creating a new treaty from scratch is a notoriously long and complex process. Are there any faster ways to establish this kind of governance? Can we build on something that already exists?
The research does point to two existing institutional structures that could be leveraged: the Montreal Protocol and the UNFCCC. Both have relevant expertise and experience in international environmental governance. They also have the institutional mechanisms for proposing, analyzing, and negotiating new agreements.
So instead of reinventing the wheel, we could build on these existing foundations. That could definitely speed things up, which seems crucial given the urgency of the situation.
Exactly. And speaking of urgency, it's important to acknowledge that there's no easy path forward. Whether we choose the Montreal Protocol or the UNFCCC, there will be both legal and political hurdles to overcome in establishing a truly effective global governance framework for SAI.
This is a lot to take in. We've gone from the science of SAI to the risks, the complex legal landscape, and now to potential solutions. I'm curious to know what stands out to you from all this. What's sparking your thinking at this point?
What really strikes me is just the sheer scale of what we're talking about. We're talking about altering the entire planet's climate system, and the ethical and political implications of that are just enormous.
It's like uncharted territory, and history has shown us that whenever new technologies emerge, especially those with the potential for both great benefit and great harm, we often struggle to govern them effectively.
Think about nuclear weapons. It took decades of tense negotiations and several close calls to establish the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other arms control agreements, and even those are constantly under pressure.
So the big question is, can we learn from those past experiences and establish a robust governance framework for SAI before things potentially spiral out of control?
The research does offer some glimmers of hope. Both the Montreal Protocol and the UNFCCC have mechanisms for amending existing agreements and adopting new protocols. They also have processes for scientific assessment, technical support, and monitoring compliance, so we could leverage these existing structures to create a dedicated governance regime for SAI rather than starting from scratch.
Okay, so let's dig into these two potential pathways, starting with the Montreal Protocol. What are the advantages of using this framework to regulate SAI? It seems like it was designed for a different problem altogether.
Well, the Montreal Protocol has a remarkable track record of success. It effectively phased out CFCs and other ozone-depleting substances. It also has a strong compliance mechanism and a flexible amendment process that allows it to adapt to new challenges.
The research mentioned the Kigali Amendment. Wasn't that a pretty big achievement within the Montreal Protocol framework?
Yes, the Kigali Amendment, adopted in 2016, expanded the Montreal Protocol to phase down HFCs, which are potent greenhouse gases. What's interesting here is that HFCs don't directly harm the ozone layer. They were included because they contribute to climate change, which can indirectly impact ozone recovery. This really shows the protocol's adaptability and its potential to address emerging environmental threats beyond its initial scope.
So if the Montreal Protocol can be used to regulate a substance that doesn't even directly impact ozone, couldn't it be adapted to regulate SII, which we know poses a potential threat to the ozone layer? It seems like a logical connection.
Exactly. The research suggests that an amendment or a new protocol could be added to the Montreal Protocol, specifically focusing on SAI. This would bring SAI under the umbrella of a treaty that already has strong compliance mechanisms and a proven track record of success.
But wouldn't we need to convince a lot of countries that SAI falls within the scope of the Montreal Protocol? It seems like a bit of a stretch.
You're right, it's not a straightforward argument, but the primary goal of the Montreal Protocol is to protect the ozone layer, and we know that sulfate-based SAI could potentially damage the ozone layer, so there's a solid argument to be made that regulating SAI is directly relevant to achieving the protocol's objectives.
And let's not forget the political advantages of working within an existing framework. It might be easier to build consensus around amending or extending an existing treaty, as opposed to starting from scratch with a brand new one. New treaties can be quite contentious.
Absolutely. The Montreal Protocol has near universal participation. Almost every country in the world is a party to it. This provides a strong foundation for collective action and could help streamline the process of establishing global governance for SAI.
Okay, so the Montreal Protocol seems like a viable option. Now let's turn to the UNFCCC. What are the pros and cons of using this framework to regulate SAI? It seems like a more natural fit given its focus on climate change.
The UNFCCC is definitely the cornerstone of international climate change law. It has a broad mandate to address climate change in all its forms, and it already includes provisions on adaptation and mitigation.
So wouldn't that make it a natural fit for regulating SAI, which is essentially a form of climate intervention?
On the surface, yes, but there are some complexities. One challenge is that the UNFCCC's main focus has been on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not on regulating geoengineering technologies, so there might be resistance from some countries to expanding its scope to include SAI. It could be seen as a distraction from the core mission of emissions reduction.
The research also mentioned the UNFCCC's consensus-based decision-making process. Could that be a hurdle?
Yeah, the UNFCCC operates on the principle of consensus, meaning that any decision requires agreement from all parties. This can make it really difficult to reach agreements quickly, especially on contentious issues like geoengineering, It can just slow down the process.
So on the one hand, the UNFCCC has a broad mandate and established institutions that could be used to regulate SAI, but on the other hand, its focus on emissions reductions and its consensus-based decision-making process could create some roadblocks. It's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Precisely. Connecting this back to the bigger picture, it seems like there's no easy path forward. Whether we choose the Montreal Protocol or the UNFCCC, we're going to face both legal and political challenges in establishing global governance for SAI.
But regardless of which pathway we choose, there are some essential elements of good governance that we should keep in mind, right? What are the guiding principles that should shape this process?
Absolutely. The research emphasizes the importance of legitimacy, transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and fairness in any governance framework for SAI. These are not just abstract concepts. They have real-world implications for how decisions are made, who has a voice in the process, and how the benefits and burdens of SAI are distributed.
Let's break those down a bit more, starting with legitimacy. Why is it so important for a governance framework to be seen as legitimate, especially in the context of something as controversial as SAI?
Legitimacy is crucial because it basically underpins the effectiveness of any agreement or institution. If a governance framework is perceived as illegitimate or biased, it's likely to be ignored or actively resisted by countries that feel excluded or disadvantaged.
So we need a framework that's not only fair and effective, but is also seen as fair and effective by the vast majority of countries. That's a tall order.
Exactly, and that's especially challenging with SAI because it raises so many ethical and political questions. Different countries have different perspectives on the risks and potential benefits of SAI. Some see it as a necessary tool to combat climate change, while others view it as a dangerous distraction from the real work of emissions reductions. Bridging those perspectives is going to be crucial.
And then there's the whole issue of power dynamics. Imagine if a handful of powerful countries controlled the decision-making process for SAI. that would hardly be seen as legitimate by the rest of the world.
You're hitting on a key point. Inclusivity is paramount. We need a governance framework that gives all countries a voice, regardless of their size, wealth, or technological capabilities. Every country deserves a seat at the table.
Okay, legitimacy and inclusivity are key. What about transparency? Why is that so crucial in the context of SAI?
Transparency means that the decision-making process is open and accessible to all stakeholders. It means that information about research, development, and potential deployment of SAI is shared widely and in a timely manner. There can't be any secrets or backroom deals.
No secret deals. Got it. So transparency is all about building trust and ensuring accountability.
Precisely. Transparency is essential for building trust and ensuring accountability. It also allows for informed public debate and scrutiny, which is vital for any technology with the potential to impact the entire planet. We need to make sure all voices are heard and all concerns are addressed openly and honestly.
Accountability goes hand in hand with transparency, right? They're two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. Accountability means that those who make decisions about SAI are held responsible for their actions. It means that there are mechanisms for addressing grievances, enforcing compliance, and providing redress for any harm caused. There have to be consequences if things go wrong.
So it's not just about making decisions in the open, but also about having consequences if those decisions turn out to be wrong or have unintended negative consequences. It's about taking responsibility for the outcomes.
That's right. Accountability is crucial for maintaining public trust and ensuring that SAI is used responsibly and ethically. We need to build in safeguards and mechanisms to address potential harm.
And finally, we have fairness. Why is fairness so important in the context of global governance of SAI?
Fairness means that the benefits and burdens of SAI are distributed equitably. It means that decisions are made with consideration for the needs and interests of all countries, especially those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We can't have a system where some countries benefit at the expense of others.
Because if SAI were to benefit wealthy, technologically advanced countries at the expense of developing nations, that would only deepen existing global inequalities and potentially lead to conflict. It would be a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. Fairness is not just a moral imperative. It's essential for global stability and cooperation. If we want SAI to be a solution, not a problem, it has to be implemented in a way that is fair and just for everyone.
So we've identified two potential pathways for establishing global governance of SAI, the Montreal Protocol and the UNFCCC. And we've discussed some of the key elements of good governance that should guide this process: legitimacy, transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and fairness. These seem like essential principles for navigating this complex and potentially dangerous territory.
Those are all critical points, but even with the best intentions and the most carefully crafted agreements, governing a technology like SAI is going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, we're talking about intentionally altering the Earth's climate system on a global scale. Unintended consequences are almost inevitable.
It really makes you wonder, even if we do manage to get the governance right, is researching and developing SAI in the first place creating a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy? The more we invest in it as a solution, the less urgency there might be to reduce emissions, and the more we delay emissions reductions, the more likely it becomes that we'll have to rely on SAI even with all of its risks.
That's a very astute observation. It's like we're walking a technological tightrope. We need to learn enough about SAI to understand its risks and potential benefits, but we can't become so reliant on it as a quick fix that we just neglect the essential task of decarbonizing our societies.
So how do we balance that need for research and development with the urgency of addressing the root causes of climate change? It seems like we need a global effort to tackle both simultaneously.
The research really emphasizes international cooperation and coordination. This isn't just an environmental issue. It has huge implications for global security, justice, and the future of humanity. We need to work together with a shared sense of responsibility and a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone. No one country can solve this alone.
It's a bit overwhelming to think about the scale of the challenge, and there's another layer to all this that we haven't really touched on. Are we as a species playing God by intentionally manipulating the Earth's climate?
That raises a really crucial question of authority in decision-making. Who gets to decide whether to deploy a technology that could impact billions of people? How do we ensure that these decisions are made democratically and with the consent of those most affected? These are questions that go beyond science and technology and touch on some pretty fundamental ethical and political values.
It feels like we're moving from the realm of science fiction into a very real and urgent debate about the future of humanity. These aren't just abstract philosophical questions anymore.
Exactly. The research you've shared paints a pretty sobering picture, but it's not entirely without hope. We have a window of opportunity to act, but it's closing fast. The decisions we make in the next few years will have profound and lasting consequences.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started by exploring the potential benefits of SAI as a climate solution, but we quickly uncovered a Pandora's box of risks, ethical dilemmas, and the urgent need for global governance.
Absolutely. What's become clear is that complacency is not an option. The future of our planet, and potentially the peace of the world, really hinges on how we navigate this uncharted territory.
This leaves you with a lot to think about. If unilateral deployment of SAI is a potential trigger for conflict, what would a just war in the age of climate change look like? Could international law adapt quickly enough to prevent a disaster? And perhaps even more fundamentally, do we have the wisdom and the will to govern a technology as powerful and potentially dangerous as SAI? Thanks for listening.